Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. My name is Mo Amir, and our featured guest tonight is going to explain populism. Is it dangerous? What does it even mean? Joining us from our nation's capital, he is a political theorist with an interest in democratic deliberation and citizenship. He writes for Maclean's and the Washington Post while hosting the podcast Open to Debate. His book, Too Dumb for Democracy: Why We Make Bad Political Decisions and How We Can Make Better Ones, is available wherever you buy your books. One of my favorite follows on Twitter, he is David Moscrop. David, thanks so much for being here tonight.
Hello, my friend. Thank you for having me.
Always my pleasure. David, now I've been accused of being a populist, a label that's also been used for all sorts of folks from Donald Trump to Bernie Sanders. But what does it mean? What is populism, and how can we spot a populist?
Well, these days it seems to mean whatever you please. I mean, everybody gets to call anybody whatever they want without any concern about what words actually mean. But populism is a little bit complicated because it's what we might call an essentially contested concept. It means that people have different conceptions of what it means. And if you ask one scholar to the next scholar, one commentator to the next commentator, you're going to get a different answer. Mm-hmm. And if they happen to be, committed to a particular ideology, partisan or otherwise, that might color how they see it. But at its fundamental, basis, a populist is someone who looks at the world and effectively divides it into more or less a couple of camps. And one is that, the everyday, ordinary, day-to-day folks, the vast majority of the population, and then effectively institutional, political, economic, social elites as a different category. And they say, well, what we need to be doing is listening to the people. Now, that can take different forms. It can take toxic forms, authoritarian, where people say, I embody those people. And that's where it takes, say, a Trumpian or a Dutertean turn, which is very different from someone like, say, Bernie Sanders, or the populists we had in Canada, in the prairies in the early bit in the middle of the last century.
Is populism on the rise in Canada? Like, are we seeing politicians adopt this idea of pitting the everyman against the quote unquote elites?
Well, I mean, it seems to be more prevalent than it was, say, for a period of time in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was awfully common, in the 80s into the 90s with the Reform Party. They were a fundamentally populist party coming out of the West. Again, in the 30s, 40s, in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was wildly popular in Canada. It's been popular at times throughout the world. It waxes and it wanes and it returns from time to time, and then it abates. I would say to a certain degree, this is a period in which it's returning, not just in Canada, but globally in different forms. Again, we see it with, say, Bernie Sanders, or with Syriza in Greece. There was a populist party. You also see it with authoritarian states, and semi-authoritarian folks like, say, Donald Trump, and again, Duterte in the Philippines. So you do see a sort of resurgence of it. And it's not uncommon to see such a resurgence when, say, you have difficult economic, social, and political times, because people get angry and they want a solution, and they start to distrust elites and elite institutions, and politicians come along and they shepherd that. And a couple of years ago, I think it was Abacus Data, did some work for Samara and basically said, to the extent that populism exists in Canada, it's largely driven by politicians who decide to pick up that mantle. And that seems to be, typically, how these things are often manifest, although sometimes it also comes from the grassroots up, which is what you'd expect from a true populist movement.
Right. So it seems like populism really flourishes in turbulent times where people are feeling disaffected or disenfranchised, and they're looking for someone to lead them and represent their interests. So is populism dangerous at its core, or at least problematic? Because to me, it seems like the specific underpinnings of a populist movement, as you mentioned, whether it's authoritarian or bigoted, that is what determines whether that set of populism or populistic beliefs is dangerous or not. It's not populism as a whole being dangerous.
Yeah, and to undermine my own attempt at being a populist, I'm going to cite Michel Foucault here and say, as Foucault would say, it's not good or bad, it's just potentially dangerous. And that's true of pretty much everything, right? I mean, everything is potentially dangerous, doesn't matter what it is. A letter opener opens your letters. It's also a weapon.
So what makes populism dangerous then?
Well, it's how it's deployed largely. Does it take a sort of toxic, authoritarian, xenophobic, racist, sexist, homophobic stand? Does it take a violent stand? Is it exclusionary in a way that is oppressive, that punches down, that is fundamentally toxic? Or is it about looking at the issues, the preferences, the concerns of day-to-day folks and saying, okay, we need to find a way to speak to, say, the needs and preferences of the working class in a structural way that bypasses, say, economic elites who have different interests that run up against the interests of the many. And so that's why you often see sort of worker-led populist pushes when people say, we're getting a raw deal, and these folks in Ottawa or New York or Toronto or Paris or London or wherever it might be, don't have the same interests as us, right? They're fundamentally different class interests. And from the ground up, we're going to push back and get something better. It's what you saw from prairie populism in this country that gave us healthcare, for instance. Without populists in Canada, in the prairies, would we have healthcare? National health insurance or provincial health insurance schemes across the country? Maybe not. So again, the question is, it's potentially dangerous. What are you going to do with it? And that's where you need responsible leaders who don't abuse and misuse it and cause harm rather than good.
Sure. So really quickly, I've heard BC Premier John Horgan being described as a populist, the guy that you want to have a beer with. Does he fit in that label?
Well, so this is where the label of populist gets bastardized, because you would then say, what, George W. Bush was a populist, right? I think we have to distinguish being a populist and being folksy, right? I mean, John Horgan is kind of folksy. George W. Bush was folksy. These are the kind of guys that you want to have a beer with, or you want to hang out with, or you want to laugh with about Star Trek, whatever it might be. And so you certainly get that from Horgan, but it doesn't make him a populist. You can see a certain populist-ish expression from time to time in policies. For instance, getting rid of bridge tolls, that you might say, okay, it has a populist tinge to it, which I think is true, but that doesn't make you a populist. And incidentally, it also often leads to bad policy, like getting rid of bridge tolls.
Well, hey, David, I appreciate this explainer. I feel like the term populism or populist gets thrown around a lot, but I think you've helped explain exactly what it means. So thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Folks, he's a political commentator and theorist. Find his writing in Maclean's and the Washington Post. He is David Moscrop. And for more with David, find This is VANCOLOUR on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to find our full chat where we discuss the popularity of a certain Conservative Party of Canada leadership candidate. Now stick around, because after some business, I am exhausted by the rah Canadian exceptionalism that many of our political elites espouse when terrorism strikes the United States. Up next, I'm going to take a moment. My name is Mo Amir. This is VANCOLOUR.